Welcome back. I'm your host at Navy Legends, and I want to begin this one with a number that the U.S. Navy has been quietly stress testing in war games since 2022. 32. 32 is the number of YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles that a single-plan Type 055 cruiser can carry in her 112-cell VLS, alongside her surface-to-air and land attack inventory. 32 anti-ship missiles from a single hull. Not a squadron, not a coordinated fleet action. One ship. And the Type 055 is not designed to fight alone. She is designed to operate as the long-range strike node of a planned surface action group, whose combined VLS depth across 3 or 4 hulls can generate an anti-ship salvo that no single Aegis-equipped defender has ever been required to manage in combat conditions. The U.S. Navy's Aegis combat system was designed in an era when the primary cruise missile threat was counted in single digits per engagement, 468 inbound contacts. The architecture of the SM-2 and ESSM engagement envelopes, the fire control illuminator capacity, the VLS magazine depth of a single cruiser or destroyer. All of it was calibrated against a threat calculus that assumed a defending ship would face, at most, a dozen simultaneous targets in the most demanding engagement scenario. 32 is not a dozen. And on March 4th, 2028, in the Taiwan Strait, the USS Port Royal was required to find out what 32 actually means. The date is March 4th, 2028. The time is 4:22 local. The central Taiwan Strait, approximately 78 nautical miles southwest of Taipei and 96 nautical miles northeast of the Penghu Islands. The USS Port Royal CG-73, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, one of the last Ticonderoga-class ships in active service, is operating as the primary air defense commander for a 7-ship logistics convoy, transiting the Taiwan Strait from Japan to Kaohsiung. The convoy carries fuel, ammunition, and military equipment assessed by the Defense Security Cooperation Agency as critical to Taiwan's defensive inventory in the context of the current crisis. It is, in operational terms, the most significant single logistics movement in the Western Pacific since the crisis began 6 weeks prior. Its safe arrival at Kaohsiung matters strategically. The plan's Joint Operations Command has assessed it as a legitimate and high-priority interdiction target. The Port Royal is the convoy's primary defender. She is positioned 12 nautical miles northwest of the convoy's lead vessel, between the convoy and the Chinese coast, on the primary threat axis. Her Aegis combat system is in full alert configuration. Her SPY-1B V-light radar is in simultaneous air and surface search mode. Her VLS carries a full combat load. SM-2 Block 3B rounds, SM-6 Block 1B dual-mode interceptors, ESSM quad-packed rounds, and Tomahawk Block 5 cruise missiles. Her fire control illuminator array, 4 Mark 99 fire control systems, each capable of guiding multiple semi-active missiles simultaneously, represents the most capable single-ship air defense architecture in the U.S. surface fleet after the departure of the older Ticonderogas from service. She is a ship designed specifically for the role she is performing, defending a high-value unit against a massive air threat. She has been built, trained, and deployed for exactly this moment. She has 122 VLS cells. The plan has 32 YJ-18 missiles assigned to this engagement, plus 28 CHFS autonomous surface vehicles staged from planned surface vessels operating behind the commercial traffic screen in the northern strait. The plan's operational concept for March 4th had been designated Strike Corridor and had been in final preparation for 21 days. Its foundation was an operational research analysis that the plan's surface warfare staff had conducted from the engagement records of every previous YJ-18 employment and every previous ESSM engagement in the Western Pacific since 2026. That analysis produced a specific assessment, a single Ticonderoga-class cruiser's SM-2 and ESSM magazine, fully expended against a sustained salvo engagement, reaches depletion at approximately 26 to 31 inbound targets, depending on the engagement geometry and per-round expenditure rate. 32 YJ-18 missiles, 2 more than the upper bound of that depletion estimate, were the planned salvo size. Not enough to guarantee penetration through the Port Royal's defenses. Enough to create a statistical expectation that 1 or 2 missiles would be in the air when the magazine ran dry. The Convoy was the actual target. The Port Royal was the obstacle. 2 planned Type 055 cruisers, the Nanchang, returned to service after her December 2027 repairs, and the Wuhan, Hull 106, her sister ship, were operating in a coordinated firing position in the northern Taiwan Strait at 422, 160 nautical miles north of the Port Royal. Both ships had been building fire control solutions on the Convoy and its escort for 94 minutes. Their Type 346 BAESA radars locked on the Port Royal's SPY-1B emissions and the Convoy's collective AIS positions. At 4:22:07, both Type 055 cruisers fired, 16 YJ, 18 rounds from each hull, 32 missiles total, in a staggered sequence designed to produce a salvo spread across an 84-second arrival window at the target. Not simultaneous, staggered. The staggered arrival was deliberate. A simultaneous arrival of 32 missiles would overload the engagement timeline in the first seconds, but would allow the Port Royal to assess the complete threat picture before the first round left her VLS. A staggered arrival of 32 missiles across 84 seconds forced the Port Royal's fire control team to begin committing interceptors before the full contact count was known, potentially misallocating resources against early contacts at the cost of residual capacity against later ones. The Port Royal's SPY-1B registered the first YJ-18 contacts at 4:23:14, 67 seconds after launch, as the leading missiles climbed to their subsonic cruise altitude and became visible above the radar horizon at 62 nautical miles. The initial contact count was 11. By 4:23:41, as additional missiles climbed into radar coverage, the count had grown to 22. By 4:24:03, the full 32 contacts were on the Port Royal's tactical display, all bearing 004 degrees at ranges between 54 and 61 nautical miles, all at subsonic cruise speed, all heading for the Convoy's position. 32 contacts. The Port Royal's commanding officer, Rear Admiral Chen Wei-lin, the cruiser's commanding officer, the Convoy's tactical commander, and the officer responsible for deciding in real time how to allocate a finite missile inventory against a contact count that exceeded her single-ship engagement doctrine, transmitted the contact report to 7th Fleet and to the USS Benfold, DDG-65, operating 18 nautical miles south as the Convoy's secondary screen at 4:24:09. She then did what the engagement doctrine prescribed and her training had prepared her for. She began committing interceptors. The YJ-18's 2-phase flight profile, subsonic cruise followed by a supersonic sprint beginning at 40 kilometers range, imposed the same engagement timeline constraint that the Donald Cook had faced in January. The subsonic cruise phase was the engagement window for SM-2, adequate detection range, adequate time of flight, manageable target speed. The supersonic sprint phase reduced the engagement to ESSM and CIWS. Against 32 contacts, the Port Royal needed to maximize SM-2 intercepts in the subsonic window before the sprint transition compressed the timeline. SM-2 Block 3B rounds began leaving the Port Royal's VLS at 4:24:19, 66 seconds after first contact detection, in a continuous firing sequence. The Aegis Combat System's engagement scheduling algorithm was simultaneously assigning interceptors, computing intercept corridors, and allocating fire control illuminators across 32 contact tracks. It was doing precisely what it had been designed to do. The question was whether what it was designed to do was sufficient. The SM-2 engagement layer ran from 042419 to 042844. 4 minutes and 25 seconds of continuous missile fire. 44 SM-2, Block 3B rounds expended, not the 2-round per target docked allocation for every contact, because 44 rounds against 32 targets meant some contacts received 1 round and some received 2. The allocation driven by engagement geometry confidence and illuminator availability at the moment. Each firing solution was computed. The SM-2 engagement produced 21 confirmed intercepts. 21 of 32 contacts neutralized in the subsonic cruise phase. 11 YJ-18 contacts surviving into the supersonic sprint phase at 042844. All 11 accelerating from Mach 0.72 to Mach 2.8 within 18 seconds. All 11 descending to sea, skimming altitude between 5 and 8 meters. 11 Mach 3 sea-skimming anti-ship missiles at ranges between 18 and 24 nautical miles from the convoy's lead vessel. The USS Benfold, from her position 18 nautical miles south, launched 16 ESSM rounds against the 8 contacts that her engagement geometry could reach without fratricide risk against the convoy vessels. 8 intercepts, 6 clean, 2 proximity misses whose targets continued with minor aerodynamic damage. The Port Royal launched her remaining ESSM inventory, 14 rounds, all available ESSM capacity from her remaining loaded cells, against the 3 contacts her geometry could cleanly engage. 2 intercepts clean. 1 ESSM proximity detonation that damaged but did not neutralize its target. A Mach 2.9 contact whose terminal seeker had survived the fragmentation and was tracking the convoy's lead vessel, the USNS Sacagawea, a Lewis and Clark class dry cargo ship at 8.4 nautical miles range. 3 YJ-18 contacts surviving the ESSM layer. 1 tracking the USNS Sacagawea. 2 tracking the Port Royal herself, their passive radar homing channels locked on the Ticonderoga's SPY 1B emissions at 4.1 and 4.8 nautical miles. The Port Royal's 2 Phalanx CIWS systems engaged simultaneously at 4:29:41. The forward phalanx acquired the closer of the 2 contacts tracking the cruiser at 3,800 meters range, a 1.3-second burst. The YJ-18 at Mach 2.9 covered 1,100 meters in the burst's flight time. The CIWS tracking algorithm computing the lead angle in real time. The burst struck the missile at 3,100 meters. The YJ-18's propulsion section was destroyed by direct hit. The missile decelerated from Mach 2.9 to near zero in 0.8 seconds and impacted the sea at 2,700 meters from the Port Royal's hull. The 300-kilogram warhead detonated on water impact. At 2,700 meters, the blast reached the Port Royal as a 0.3 G impulse. Logged. Inconsequential. The aft phalanx engaged the second contact tracking the Port Royal at 3,400 meters range. A 1.1-second burst. The YJ-18 at Mach 2.8 was struck at 2,900 meters. Propulsion destroyed. Water impact at 2,300 meters. Warhead detonation at 2,300 meters. 0.4 G impulse. Again, consequential only as a logged event. The third surviving YJ-18, the one tracking the USNS Sacagawea, was not the Port Royal's engagement geometry problem. It was between the convoy and its current position. The Benfold's aft CIWS had a 12-degree coverage gap that placed this contact outside her CIWS engagement sector at this bearing. The Sacagawea carried no defensive weapons. The convoy's other vessels, 4 commercial cargo ships and 2 ammunition ships under contract with Military Sealift Command, carried no defensive weapons. The convoy was not a warfighting formation. It was a logistics formation with one Aegis cruiser and one destroyer protecting it. At 4:29:44, 3 seconds after the Port Royal's CIWS engaged her own 2 contacts, the Benfold's commanding officer made the call that the engagement record would later describe as the critical decision of March 4th. He ordered the Benfold to interpose between the surviving YJ-18 and the Sacagawea, placing the destroyer's hull between the inbound missile and the cargo ship. The Benfold turned hard to starboard at maximum speed, closing the distance to the YJ-18's computed approach path. The Benfold's forward CIWS engaged the contact at 4,100 meters range as the destroyer crossed into the engagement geometry. A 1.0 second burst. Clean intercept. The YJ-18 was neutralized at 3,400 meters from the Benfold's hull, but 1,600 meters from the Sacagawea's position. The YJ-18 salvo engagement was complete. 32 missiles, 21 neutralized by SM-2, 8 by ESSM, 3 by CIWS, 0 penetrations to the convoy. The Port Royal had expended 44 SM-2 rounds and 14 ESSM rounds. Her VLS, which had begun the engagement with 122 cells, now had 64 functional cells remaining. Many of the expended cells were reloadable only in port, and the safe lockout condition of 4 additional cells from the engagement's shock transients further reduced the operational inventory. She was still capable of defending the convoy. She had enough SM-2 capacity for a second engagement of similar scale, but not a third. The CHFS surface vehicle phase began at 4:31:08, 27 minutes after the YJ-18 launch. Time to arrive as the Port Royal and Benfold were completing their post-engagement system, restarts, and damage assessments. 28 CH-FS contacts at 26 nautical miles, bearing 006 degrees, accelerating from near zero to 29 knots. Their approach bearing placed them directly from the north, the same axis as the YJ-18 salvo, in a formation designed to exploit the Port Royal's northwest-facing sensor posture, as her crew assessed the YJ-18 engagement's aftermath. The Port Royal and Benfold's gun systems opened fire at 4:31:54 as the contacts reached 23 nautical miles. The Port Royal's Mark 45 5-inch gun began systematic engagement of the northern contact group, 16 contacts in a compressed arc. The Benfold took the southern 6 contacts. Both ships launched ESSM rounds at 4:32:44 as the leading contacts reached 14 nautical miles. The surface engagement was less complex than the missile battle that had preceded it, but it required the same level of sustained precision from crews who had been at general quarters for 39 minutes, who were managing post-YJ-18 system restarts, and who were simultaneously processing the second threat picture with systems whose operators were operating at the upper boundary of sustainable cognitive load. 6 ESSM rounds against 6 leading contacts, 5 intercepts clean, 1 proximity miss whose target continued at reduced speed with guidance damage. The Benfold's MH-60R, launched at 4:31:22, 46 seconds into the CHFS contact picture, reached the swarm at 4:33:47 and began systematic Hellfire engagement. 8 Hellfire rounds expended over 7 minutes. 7 confirmed CHFS vehicles neutralized by Hellfire before the helicopter expended its load. The combined gun, ESSM, and Hellfire engagement reduced the CHFS contact count from 28 to 6 between 04:31:54 and 04:40:11. 6 vehicles remaining at ranges between 3.8 and 5.9 nautical miles from the Port Royal. The Port Royal's 2 phalanx CIWS, both Mk-38 25mm mounts, and her 5-inch gun worked the final contact systematically. The last CHFS vehicle was neutralized at 4:43:22 by the Port Royal's aft phalanx at 1,100 meters range. Total surface engagement duration, 12 minutes and 14 seconds. 28 CHFS contacts, all 28 neutralized. The convoy had not been struck. The USNS Sacagawea and her 6 companion vessels had continued their transit throughout both phases of the engagement, maintaining their course and speed under the Port Royal's tactical direction. The convoy arrived at Kaohsiung at 1644 local. Its cargo was offloaded within 36 hours. The retaliatory authorization reached the Port Royal at 4:51, 29 minutes after the YJ-18 launch. The target package covered the 2 planned Type 055 cruisers and the CH-FS staging vessels from which the surface vehicle swarm had been deployed. The Type 055 targeting was the operational priority. Both Nanchang and Wuhan had fired on a U.S. Navy warship and on a U.S.-escorted logistics convoy transiting international waters. The self-defense authorization was unambiguous. 12 Tomahawk Block 5 rounds from the Port Royal and Benfold launched at 4:58:44. 8 rounds targeted at the computed positions of the Nanchang and Wuhan, 4 per hull, based on their last known course and speed with projected position updates. 4 rounds targeted the 2 CHFS staging vessels, identified by the P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft that had been supporting the convoy transit. The Nanchang and Wuhan had been maneuvering at maximum speed since their YJ-18 launch, executing the standard plan evasive protocol for a hull that has revealed its position through a weapons employment. By the time the Tomahawks arrived at 5:44, both Type 055 cruisers had relocated from their firing positions. The 4 Tomahawks assigned to the Nanchang impacted empty ocean at her projected position, plus 1 standard deviation of maneuver displacement. The 4 Tomahawks assigned to the Wuhan found the same result. 1 round impacted close enough to a Wuhan-assigned position to produce post-strike signal intelligence, suggesting the Wuhan had been in the blast radius of 1 Tomahawk at close range. But the nature and extent of any damage could not be confirmed from available collection. The 2 CHFS staging vessels, both operating under commercial registry with AIS activated, were struck by 2 Tomahawk rounds each at 5:46:11 and 5:47:03. Both vessels were assessed as rendered inoperable. 1 sank. The other was underway with severe flooding when a combined Maritime Forces patrol vessel responded to its emergency beacon at 8:22. Here at Navy Legends, March 4th, 2028, is the engagement that tests the number we opened with, 32. The Port Royal faced 32 YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles from 2 Type 055 cruisers, an anti-ship salvo that exceeded every single ship engagement scenario in the Aegis architecture's design baseline. She neutralized all 32. The arithmetic: 44 SM-2 rounds, 14 ESSM rounds, and 6 CIWS bursts against 32 inbound contacts. 0 penetrations to the convoy, but the arithmetic that the plan's operational research staff will focus on is different. The Port Royal entered the engagement with 122 VLS cells. She exited with 64. A second YJ-18 salvo of 32 rounds against a cruiser that now has 64 functional cells and a depleted ESSM inventory changes the intercept probability distribution fundamentally. The plan's 2 Type 055 cruisers had 64 YJ-18 rounds between them. They fired 32 on March 4th. They have 32 remaining, against a Port Royal with 64 cells. The convoy reached Kaohsiung. The cargo was delivered. The tactical outcome was unambiguous. What the strategic calculus requires is not one convoy transit, but sustained convoy operations, week after week, transit after transit, each one requiring the same magazine depth from the same limited number of Aegis-capable ships. The plan does not need to sink a Ticonderoga-class cruiser to win an attrition campaign against U.S. convoy protection in the Taiwan Strait. It needs to fire enough missiles across enough engagements to ensure that when the critical convoy transits, the ones that determine whether Taiwan can sustain its defensive position, The ships protecting them have already expended the majority of their interceptors against the preceding engagements. 32 missiles, 1 transit, 64 cells remaining. The next convoy leaves Japan in 72 hours. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. I'll see you in the